This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We're kicking off this Monday's programming with K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. He's sharing pertinent information in this week's cattle market update on stability in the past week for cash and futures and interesting food service demand for the month of August that might have potentially been influenced by college football. Also ahead, the phones have been ringing off the hook with producer questions regarding baling failed crops. Ignacio Ciampitti, K-State Farm Systems Specialist, provides valuable insight on the many trade-offs of baling in the case of corn and soybeans. We conclude today's programming with this week's wildlife segment from K-State Wildlife Extension Specialist Drew Ricketts. He shares information regarding Antler Point Restrictions for deer hunting and a public service announcement on positive attitudes this hunting season. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are starting off our Monday program as we always do with our cattle market update for the week. To cover it this week, we have with us Glynn Tonsor. He is a K-State livestock economist. So, Glenn, thanks for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure for being on.
Absolutely. We were chatting football here before we actually went on the air. So, a good weekend for K-State.
Oh, indeed. Good for K-State. Not so good for some ex-Big 12 teams.
Yes.
Those of us who are into fantasy football, we're kicking the year off well. So I hope our listeners enjoy the weekend.
Absolutely. I hope students did as well, though a lot of them staying in the stadium, even though it was some, worse for wear conditions. But it was a fun game to watch.
However, we're here to talk cattle markets. We cannot cuss the rain. Right? So, some context is important. If some of us got wet on Saturday, so be it. Nobody melted, right? We need some more of that. I just drove to Denver, and we need more rain. So.
Yes, it was definitely enjoyable and an exciting sight to see for sure. But speaking of the cash cattle markets, let's get into that. So what did we see this week really in terms of movement? Yeah,
so this week overall was a fairly calm week on balance for loose people in the numbers, and there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes you need calmness in the markets. The cash trade for fed cattle was about 141. It was called steady on the week by AMS. And we look over at feeder cattle. AMS called the Pratt market mixed. I wrote down a few different lots I'll share in a moment, but they were most were just, flat $2 up or down. There's a couple cases of $5 movement, depending on the weight class you'd quote. The two lots I wrote it down for reference is 129 head, weighing 465 pounds. So this is a lightweight example. Came in at 208. I'll highlight that because I think we're going to continue to hear about prices over $2. Things are set up for that for the foreseeable future. And as long as we don't have another black swan event, lower cattle numbers and the broader economic things that are at play, is I think we're going to have calves north of $2 for a bit. 122 head is weighing 764 pounds, so those would not be the calves here. Weighing 177 are two, example lots. Those both would be kind of on par with the past couple weeks. When you look over to the board, so CME futures contracts, looking at Friday's close, the October live cattle contract closed at 146. That was up about $1 on the week. And then the October feeder cattle contract closed at 186, up slightly, I believe 50 cents on the week. So again, before I go any further, just put a bow on that. There was no major changes I shared there. It was a pretty ho-hum week on balance.
Should we expect any major changes in the week or so ahead, or can we expect kind of the stability to continue for a while?
Well, here's to stability. I think it would be good for all the market participants. We had some, but there's several things weighing on the market more generally. And as we alluded to, half joking, but I was trying to interject the football and travel comment is, Mother Nature's role on the markets is still there for sure. Some of that's the feed grain space, which Dan O'Brien and others talk to regularly. But specific to the cattle markets, exactly how many feeder cattle have already been sold, how many have been pulled forward, what will be the volume, we're sitting here in September. As we go through October, November, what is the realized volume that goes through the Pratts, the Salinas, the Oklahoma Cities, the like, our listeners are regularly watching. There's a fair amount of uncertainty this year on exactly how many we have pulled forward, done different, pushed into the feed yard early. I think that's on the short list of things to watch. In a minute, we're going to talk a lot about beef demand, as I always do, the macroeconomic uncertainty and what that means for beef demand, and therefore the ability to support these higher prices certainly remains on the table to watch as well. But that's a bit of a segue into the cutout numbers and so forth. But what I really want to hone in for our listeners is a ho-hum week is okay. Sometimes that just adds stability to the market. We don't always have to be talking about 5 and 10% moves.
Absolutely segued really well into into our next market we're going to look at, and it's the box beef cutout market. So what did we really see there?
Yeah, so Friday, USDA called the choice market at $2.57, as off about $2 from the Friday before, and they called select at $2.36, off about $3 from the week before. So just a little bit of weakness there. I'm not going to overreact to that, as it's in balance of small changes. Side note, I didn't make a note on this. Actually, the July beef export numbers came in, topping $1 billion again. So I'm highlighting that because there still continues to be some export demand strength. Even though we have some gray clouds on the horizon there, I continue to be amazed how strong that is. That's one of the reasons I think these cutout values have stayed up, despite the fact that we still have year-to-date production volumes that are higher than last year. What I'm alluding to there is the last thing on our notes here is exactly what were our processing volumes last week. Remember, we have Labor Day effect in this as well, so the overall number is going to be a little bit lower. But the initial estimates through Saturday were 604,000 head. That's up from about 579 the same week the year before. And importantly, and this is the number I just said, was year-to-date, and we're now into September, so year-to-date is well over half of the year, is we've harvested more than last year, 1.3% more. That is not something that certainly 90 days and 180 days ago all of us were expecting, and it's because of this pulling cattle forward, the drought effect, and so forth. Our ability to continue to move a heavy volume of cattle and sustain, at least historically, larger cutout numbers, they are down from their peaks for sure, indirectly is a testament to both domestic and foreign beef demand strength, and I hope it continues.
Absolutely. That was exports of $1 billion. That was how many times consecutively has that happened now?
Oh, I don't know the number consecutive month. I believe it's the fifth time this year.
Wow.
I mean, we're testing my memory on the fly because I didn't write this one down.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. But yeah, for the month of July, we topped $1 billion. We're moving larger volumes than the past. And there is a lot of macroeconomic uncertainty around the world, and that tends to slow, quote-unquote, expensive protein purchasing, which is what U.S. beef is in the broader global context. If you pause there, I think USMF, so United States Meat Export Federation, should get a lot of credit for continuing to build and expand market access. That goes on. There's a multi-decade effort at play there, not just month to month. So a little bit of a shout-out there for success. But then closer to home, the comparative advantage of the U.S. beef cattle industry, namely it's us and Canada, basically they're the grain-finished sellers in the world, and having the economic signals that span from seed stock all the way to the end consumer that encourage producers to make those investments. So some are genetics, some are feeding management and the like. We need to never lose sight of those things. The recent success, and I do hope it continues, but the recent success of being able to say over $1 billion in exports per month, in no small part is a function of things that have been done a week ago, a month ago, sometimes 20 years ago in the industry, and we need to keep that in mind when we have broader industry debates that have been going on for the last couple of years.
Absolutely, yeah. A highlight of our market for sure. So going into some more demand updates, we're talking about demand here, but August Meat Demand Monitor, what did it really show this month?
Yeah, so this recently was posted to Ag Manager. For those that don't follow this is partially funded by Beef and Pork Checkoff. So all this information you can find on our website. I'm going to synthesize the main points here today. August demand, it was down retail, up food service. Narrowly, we have two beef categories, so ribeye steak and ground beef. Couple pork, as well as chicken breast and some other proteins that are tracked. And across the board, with the exception of plant-based patties, they were just flat for the month compared to July, was grocery store retail demand was down. And before I talk food service, I want to highlight kind of an underneath thing that we see in this project specific to at-home protein purchasing is one of the things, Samantha, we do in that project is ask not just, hey, did you have a meal or not, did you skip it, but where did you have it, which is what I'm talking about here on the market channel. Mm-hmm. But if you had protein at home, where did you procure that protein from? And grocery stores certainly remain the lion's share, well over majority, which is not surprising. So Kroger, Safeway et al. Is the most common source of protein when people consume beef, pork, chicken at home. However, what I want to highlight, and the reason I'm doing this long-winded interjection, is in August, the number that said they bought their protein for at-home consumption from merchandisers, so think Walmart and Target, and the number that bought it from club stores, so think Costco and Sam's Club, both were well up. And I'm interjecting that because we've been talking a lot about response to inflation, but I think this is an indication that folks are shifting to where they buy their protein and probably buying a bigger volume when they buy it. I mean, if you think through the outlets I just talked about, they may have a more expensive trip, but I think they're finding ways to get the price per pound lower by buying something bigger and then taking it home and cutting it up or doing a bigger roast and you get multiple meals or whatever the case would be. We're not done talking about the inflation response is really what I'm trying to highlight. And one of the shifts that I think we're starting to see is exactly what channel within the at-home space people are buying their protein through.
Absolutely, yeah. A little bit more cost-effective choices there in terms of, like you said, bigger purchase at forefront, but a little bit more cost-effective over time.
Yeah, and we've been seeing for 4 or 5 months now a growing number of people saying they're making changes. And one of those is, I'm changing the cut. So I've been using the example going from ribeye to sirloin. Well, embedded in that is if you're moving away from, maybe you used to go to a grocery store that you really liked getting your best pork chop or your best ribeye from. Well, if you have internally said, well, I'm going to take a break from doing that for a couple months, then you may be doing more of a bulk. I mean, you're still a heavy protein consumer, right? So they're still relevant. We still need to monitor it. But if you're not, quote unquote, upgrading in that example, you may also be changing exactly where you buy it. And that's the first month we've seen that change in the MDMs, why I'm highlighting here. And as we go through the fall here, it's going to be worth watching.
Absolutely. And a little bit different of a change here this month in terms of food service purchases. I think last time we spoke, they had been down in some ways. Now we're seeing that everything's up.
Yeah. Now, this is a month-over-month statement. So when we compare August and July, food service demand, and even more narrowly, demand for dinner meals away from home, certainly was up. And that was across the board, all the proteins that we look at here. And you're right, that is breaking trend from the past. I didn't make the notes here, but it's going on my memory. We also just categorized where you have your meal, and I alluded to it a minute ago in my comments. The percentage that ate away from home in August was up from July. It was flat for breakfast and was up for the other two meals, if I remember right. So foot traffic was up through restaurants. And as a cross confirmation of this, if you like, I am the geek that gets a lot of stuff come across my desk. I try to track that so I can do interviews like this better. But I'm a subscriber to something called the Daily Shot. It's a spinoff from the Wall Street Journal, and it's an infographic. Samantha, I literally look at like 300 figures every morning, and it's summary of what's going on. But one of them is foot traffic through restaurants by states. And in the South, particularly Texas and Florida, stood out on these charts, is August foot traffic through restaurants was way up. This is consistent with what I just told you for the MDM. So if foot traffic went up through restaurants, food service demand went up as well. Hopefully that's offset what was a little bit of a pullback in retail demand.
Yeah, interesting trends, though, specifically in the South. I wonder the reasoning behind that.
Well, we were joking about football earlier. Yeah. It is possible that's what's going on. Some celebrations on, I usually joke the SEC, they start well before Saturday, but, there's the evening jokes, evening meals out, and just general population dynamics and whatever. We need to care about what's going on in the South because the country's growing population-wise there as well. But I don't want to lose sight of the general trend here is in August, it looks like food service meat demand went up. Retail demand may have had a little bit of weakness. Hopefully on balance, we were at least holding our own.
Glynn, as always, we thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me on, Samantha.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Glynn Tonsor. He's a livestock economist here at K-State, sharing with us information for our weekly cattle market update. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now with Ignacio Ciampitti. He is a K-State farming system specialist, and he's joining us today to talk about some baling options in terms of some of our crops that we produce here in Kansas. Ignacio, I know you've been getting lots of calls about concerns over this.
Yeah, thanks, Sam, for this opportunity to discuss on this. There has been a lot of concern from many people across the state. Did many discussions with many farmers in central Kansas, western part of the state, southeast. A little bit of history, So if we start looking at our current growing season, I think that we will get to understand where we are at this point. So we just have an article a couple of weeks ago on the update that we discuss about effects of drought and heat on soybeans, which usually we don't discuss too much on those type of stressors because in many situations they are more relevant for corn when most of the times the early planted corn gets to flowering mid-July or early July. We know that we have always issues on heat and drought. On soybeans, that's not the case. We usually have the critical time for development of yield formation is around mid-August, late August. This year, August was not one of our best August so far.
No, it was not. It was very warm and very dry, as we all know. And because of that, once again, you mentioned this was an issue we commonly hear about in corn. So, of course, we have corn yield concerns, but soybean, something that we're not really expecting year to year, and now there's concerns even over that.
Yeah, I would say in corn, we have seen already many situations, people that they were already chopping, removing the corn before harvest, silage options, many fields that they already went through that because the yields were extremely low. And we always ask farmers to start looking at this, and this will be the time to start also looking and be on top of this for soybeans. So on corn is kind of a little bit on the simple side because we have a yield estimation, we go to the field, we look at the ears, we count kernels. And in many situations, if the yields are extremely low, and in many cases below 100, and in many situations even below that 60, 70, it doesn't make any sense to even continue that corn and moving all the way to harvest. Less concerns we have in the past on soybeans. I mean, soybeans was something that, again, as I explained before, because of the type of season and usually gets to the critical timing for yield formation later, we have less concerns in the past. And this has been a year to prove to be a challenge for many people, and it's just a challenge for soybeans. And what we start seeing is questions coming from multiple parts of the state, asking about value of basically haying or baling the soybeans, and really trying to understand what are the benefits and the pros and the cons on doing that practice. So, and I think that at this point, before we get into the recommendations or what are the options that we have, we need to also make sure to go to the fields and assess the potential conditions of the crop. Some of the late planted soybeans, it might be in a much better shape than the early planted. And we have seen some fields that too early planted, that soybeans already went south, on the way of saying that the grain filling, which is one of the most relevant components for yield formation on soybean, that seed weight usually contributes between 30 to 40% of the final yield. And usually that should last 35, 40 days. This year it has been tested, and in many cases we are seeing that it lasted only 25, 30 days. And then to give a sense of how much important is this seed filling, timing, we documented in the past 5 days only. Taking away 5 days for seed filling, it was basically impacting 10 bushels, less.
Yeah, when you put it into perspective like that, when we're thinking about acres and acres, that's a big difference. So
imagine a farmer that went to the field mid-August, early August, did an yield estimation saying, okay, based on pod number, my yields are around 40, 50 bushels. We continue to have heat and dry conditions. And if you cut that seed filling in 10 days, you went from that yield estimation plus pod abortion that we never quantify very easily to 20 bushels. And then for that farmer that goes to the field today or is going to the field in the last couple of weeks and start looking at those soybeans that in some cases are, even the late planted, are usually really small. They have not really many pods. You are facing the condition or a situation that you start thinking about, even if I do a quick yield estimate, if my yields are below 20, what are the options I have right now?
Absolutely. And one of those, an unconventional one that I didn't even know was an option, honestly, before our conversation today, is baling for soybeans. So what does that really look like for these producers?
Well, there are a couple of challenges. We always talk about corn, and we discussed in the past corn. So the only thing that I will say on this, some level of concern could be on the nitrate levels. Why? Well, under drought conditions, we already know this. Corn usually has a problem of taking up nitrogen because it's affected by the growth, but still is able to take up some nitrogen, and then most of that nitrogen stays on the lower part of the stalks and it stays on the form of nitrate. Mm-hmm. And nitrate could be toxic. Be careful, test for nitrate content in the stalks before you are planning to move it to the animal feeding. So that's one point on corn before I move to soybeans. On soybeans, it's quite complex. The complexity comes from a farmer needs to take a decision. Do I have enough forage to really make a case on baling? Or what is the problem if I just remove all the forage from the ground and then I'm leaving basically the soil bare for the entire winter? And then most likely until my next growing season, they are not moving to winter crops, which in many cases so far they are not thinking on winter crops because there is no moisture.
Yep.
So these are the challenges that we're facing today, and then it's kind of a decision tree. So imagine that you are on the shoes of the farmer and then you are like baling, yes or no, and if yes, then you start thinking about what is the value. Getting there to the field with the machine, the time, the cost of moving that, the fuel cost, and then the questions are on nutrient value. In many situations, we never discuss on soybeans, but when we are removing just grain at harvest, we usually tend to remove a lot of nitrogen, because it's a high-protein crop. So usually 70% of all the nitrogen of the crop is on the seeds. So we usually tend to do that. We already remove nitrogen. We know that soybeans, they usually tend to fix nitrogen, so we don't worry too much about that as a value replacement of fertilizer. But then there is a small point that we need to clarify is on the potassium. Usually most of the potassium stays on the plant with the residues. So the rest of the potassium that stays with the residues basically goes through a recycling process and goes back to the soil. So for those farmers, specifically those that they are with potassium problems in soils, and I'm thinking more about the southeast, they need to start thinking about what is the replacement value of removing, and even if you are removing 10 bushels, because you are removing a lot of potassium. And then you need to start thinking if you are getting really paid that amount. We have some targets, values of nutrients. And we will be sharing some of these resources. And our soil fertility specialist is an excellent contact point, Dr. Ruiz Diaz, to talk more about this nutrient value replacement. We put I think that there was an article a couple months ago on corn. Very soon might be one on soybeans.
Yes.
More thinking on these decisions, because when you need to take a decision on what you want to do with your crop, you also need to think about what is the value that you get from per unit, and also start thinking about what is your replacement value. And specifically, when we need to put some value to forage, I think that one of the easy ways to do that is to start thinking about nutrient reposition and replenishment. And in soybeans specifically, I think that except for some of the regions that they don't have problems on potassium, central, western Kansas, in some of the places that you really need to apply potassium and replenish potassium in soils, you need to start thinking about what is that basically replacement value. And these are some of the challenges that we need to start thinking when we need to take a decision of leaving the crop on the ground, thinking in a more alternative as a conservation approach, versus the value of removing the crop and leaving soil with no crop. And the potential problems, I think that they will be emphasizing more in situations when you have like more elevation or topography. And then if you have high slopes, in some of those situations, we know that soybeans don't leave much residue. But if you ask me, I'd rather leave some rather than just to go with the situation of leaving the soil with nothing. And again, I think that the farmers, they need to kind of wait. And these are really, don't want to be in their shoes, the really hard decision. And also I think that it's compromising. If you are moving to winter wheat, there is also an effect of the residue on the following crop.
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of different trade-offs for producers to be taking into account right now. And like you said, I feel like the classic extension answer is it depends. It depends on your operation. It really does.
In this case specifically, I think that it depends. It plays a big role because if you are thinking more long-term strategy, and I also kind of understand farmers that are thinking about, short-term. Mm-hmm. And I'm also putting myself into their side and saying, I need to get some value right now. I need to pay bills. I need to make sure that I can get some revenue and profit from this field, and this is my solution. The only thing is think about when you are thinking about this solution, what are the implications? And the implications are, if you are continuing those fields and continue the next summer season too, think about implications on replenishing and the fertilizer replacement costs, because even on soybeans, there are fertilizer replacement costs like potassium that it should be considered into the equation.
Well, Ignacio, if producers are tuning in and they're looking for more, where can they find that?
We have an excellent resource that is our e-update. If you go to agronomy.ksu.edu and then you have a click on the right, you have the archive of all the e-update you can search. The last couple of e-updates, we have a few resources on drought and heat-stressed soybeans. That will also put some information on what to do next. And then I mentioned this resource from Ruiz Diaz, our soil fertility specialist. He has an article on these corn replacement fertilizer values. So you have all our contacts there too. So as always, feel free to reach out. And we are having several questions on these topics. So we know that it's something that is current and is a big challenge for many farmers across the state at this moment.
You guys are a valuable resource to take advantage of for sure. So encouragement to reach out if you guys have any additional questions. But Ignacio, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for the invitation, as always.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Ignacio Ciampitti. He is a K-State farming system specialist speaking on baling options with some of our crops this year. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are ending today's program with our weekly wildlife segment. We have with us Drew Ricketts, our wildlife extension specialist from here at K-State. So, Drew, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Samantha. This is one of the highlights of my every other week.
That's kind. I feel the same. Today, we're going to be talking about a unique subject. It's Antler Point Restrictions on deer. And we don't have this currently enforced in Kansas, but the subject inspired a thought for you.
It did, yeah. So Antler Point Restrictions are imposed to basically try and protect a certain segment of a deer population. And usually the goal is to protect younger bucks from harvest so that they can get older and potentially get bigger. And that got me to thinking, because deer season just started, about how different hunters have different values about the deer that they want to harvest.
Sure. So, a young hunter that it's maybe their first season, their trophy per se might be something different than a very seasoned hunter that this might be their 10th or 11th season.
Exactly. So basically, the more of an animal that we encounter or the more that we have the opportunity to harvest, the value that we have towards different types of those animals shifts. So if I have the opportunity to harvest many large antlered bucks, then that's going to probably be my definition of a trophy. Whereas if I haven't had the opportunity to harvest a lot of large antlered bucks, then my trophy might actually be a doe. And so I think that it's very, very important for us to remember that people have different values about different critters, and we need to avoid some of the shaming that goes on, especially on some of the big Facebook pages and that sort of thing, about whether or not somebody should have harvested an animal or let it walk.
Absolutely, yeah. It should be a place of encouragement, especially on Facebook pages with people with similar interests. So definitely a good PSA and a reminder for this upcoming hunting season, like you mentioned. Getting into more of these Antler Point Restrictions study that you read, that's what inspired this conversation, but it kind of showed that there's some positives, but also some negatives when it comes to this. So tell us a bit about this study out of New York.
Their goal was to protect those yearling bucks, and they also had the idea that this might put more pressure on does, because some of the hunters that would typically harvest a yearling buck, when they didn't have the opportunity to do that, would shift that harvest over to a doe that didn't have antlers. And of course, we've talked about in previous episodes how important that doe harvest is from a population management standpoint. What they saw was that it very much did protect most of the yearling bucks. So prior to the Antler Point restriction, they saw around 60% of the male harvest every year was yearling bucks. That shifted down to around 15%. So it protected a whole lot of yearlings from harvest. It didn't have any effect at all on the proportion of harvest that was antlerless deer, so those does that they were wanting to harvest.
Also, some potential negative consequences in terms of the animals that have the greatest potential to grow into some of those bigger bucks that we look forward to seeing every year.
Some of my colleagues down in Mississippi looked at the effects of Antler Point restrictions on basically maximum potential antler growth for a population. And when we think about this, that 13 to 19% or 15% on average from this New York study actually had 3 points on one side as yearlings. Those bucks are often the bucks that have the greatest potential because of their genetics, because of maternal nutrition, to become the largest bucks. So what they may actually be doing is removing those potential 200-inch deer when they're 5 or 6 years old, when they're young, by placing more of an emphasis of harvest on deer with more antler points.
So a negative consequence in that matter if we're thinking that we want these animals to grow to their greatest potential.
It could be. And, this is not something that is being thought about being implemented in Kansas. This is just a new study looking at a way to manage deer populations. There are some potential positives. There's also some potential negatives.
Fun conversation to have for sure, and something interesting for listeners to think about as they're going into hunting season this fall. So, Drew, as always, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Samantha, and good luck to everybody who's out there preparing to deer hunt.
Once again, that was Drew Ricketts. He is our wildlife extension specialist here at K-State, covering Antler Point restrictions on deer. We'll be back with more tomorrow on Agriculture Today.